Hello, everybody. Welcome to Blissfully Living. I'm joined today with my great friend, Nathan Hawkins, Dr. Nathan Hawkins. He's a PhD graduate from the University of Cambridge in philosophy. And I've been watching a lot of his videos and his recent discussions with Bernardo Castro, and I found him to be really like he paid tons of attention to detail, which I really appreciated about him. And he went really deep, like an investigator, into these philosophies without any judgment, with a really being even-handed. So I really appreciated the attitude you took towards Bernardo. And today I'm
Thank you.
really interested to learn about your theory of the nature of reality, and then we'll go deeper into the the details of your theory and the implications of that. But even before that, could you maybe even begin by speaking why you became interested in these questions and what age did that start? And yeah.
Okay, yeah, they're big questions. So I think I discovered philosophy pretty late, actually. I didn't even go to university until I was 30. Um, so I didn't go to university at 18. If I had, I would have studied mathematics. That was what I was always good at school, but didn't have parents who went to university. I did get an offer to study at Oxford, but I didn't make one of the grades to do maths. And then didn't want to go to Bristol, which was my second choice. And I'd started a business by then, so I got involved with that business. Um, I think I've always had an interest in philosophical questions without realizing that's what it was. Most of my interest is directed at in religious directions. I was very involved with well, especially after my dad left when I was 11, brought up single mother, five children, got very involved in an evangelical church that we were attending, and that sort of became our life, really. So I had a lot of enthusiasm, maybe not so much wisdom or understanding, but a lot of enthusiasm. And then I don't know if this is typical for lots of people. I stumbled across C.S. Lewis when I was about 18, 19, and I realized that there's a way to approach these bigger questions in quite a thought through way. So I really devoured a lot of his stuff
Mm.
in my early 20s. But then, sort of mid 20s, maybe later 20s, I came across a philosopher of religion. He's actually a chap called Peter Rollins. I don't know if you know of him. Um, and I realized he was approaching these questions with a completely different toolkit that I just didn't have any access to, his philosophical toolkit. And that got me interested. So after I got married, I was 30, my wife was 25. She decided she wanted to go to university because she never did. Gone to uni when I was 18. So I enrolled in a maths course, but then had some elective papers, took those in philosophy, and then slowly philosophy sort of took over the maths. So I did a maths and philosophy bachelor's degree. This is in New Zealand. My wife's
Mhm.
from New Zealand. And then decided I wanted to be a philosopher. And my lecturers told me that I shouldn't study in New Zealand if I wanted to be a philosopher. I should go overseas. So I was born in the UK, and so came back here. Incredibly, I mean, because I've been out of the country, I was an international student, but I managed to get the Bill Gates scholarship for Cambridge, which is
Wow.
really, really. I think I probably didn't realize how unlikely it was that I would be able to study here. So we actually moved here, and then I began applying.
Mm.
And I was finishing because I got a master's degree, two master's degrees. The first was through my New Zealand university, and they said the year's out of sync. I won't go into mass. The year's out of sync because it's in the southern hemisphere.
Mhm.
So what Kiwis usually do when they're applying to universities in America or the UK is they start their masters in New Zealand and then they sort of transfer it over after
Yeah.
a few months, so they're not just twiddling their thumbs. So that's what I had done, and I thought I'd come to the UK while I apply. Found out I was international, and I qualified for the Gates scholarship because you're not supposed to get it if you're British, but because had to count as an international student, I was able to apply for it.
That's
So
wonderful. Yeah.
yeah, incredibly, I got into both Oxford and Cambridge when I applied. Um, Wanted to go to Oxford because I had felt I missed out at the age of 18. This could be redemptive, but I didn't get the funding for Oxford, but I got
Mm.
the Bill Gates scholarship for Cambridge, which is really good because they are very generous. They give you extra funding for children, and I had two children while studying.
Wow.
So I wouldn't recommend that to people listening. I think you're better to do this stuff in your 20s than to try and fit it in later in life. But I did manage to do it, and absolutely no regrets. It was brilliant. So yeah. Oh, as for metaphysics, I think what happened when I started studying, I realized I wanted to look at metaphysics because it was the area of philosophy that I thought was most close to the questions I had. What is the nature of reality? How should I understand reality in light of my what I realized was a strong faith in God? Um, and But my undergraduate university didn't really do metaphysics. They did it sometimes, but there just wasn't much interest in it. It was a relatively small university, so I knew that's what I wanted to do at postgraduate level. And I started with David Lewis, standard analytic stuff. I mean, that was a real baptism of fire, going from not really doing metaphysics to suddenly doing postgraduate metaphysics at Cambridge in this very heavily technical way. Fortunately, my maths background helped me through a bit, but yeah, I did quite well. And then I got interested in Schaffer's monism. I don't know if you've come across that. He's got a view priority monism, and I thought that sounded really interesting. And I looked at Timothy Williamson's necessitism, which is the idea that necessarily everything necessarily exists. So the idea of necessary existence. But the more I looked into these views, I just realized that the way they were trying to answer these questions was in this sort of Quinean ontological way, in that if you want to know what exists, what's the domain of your most parsimonious logic? What truth makers do you need in your theory? And I thought, this is already quite far downstream in terms of how we understand the world. If you think, so for example, when I talked to someone at Cambridge about what I was wanting to do, he said to me, well, you need to model it in first order logic because first order logic is metaphysically neutral. And even then I thought, no, it isn't. It's not metaphysically neutral. You can't have an empty domain, and you can't have predicates in your domain. You can't have properties in your domain varying over. This is already assuming a lot. And somewhere along that same period, I started my PhD thesis to be studying monism, the idea that reality is one. When they say reality is one, they only mean concrete reality, physical reality. They just don't touch any of the other stuff. So Schaffer thinks there are transfinite numbers of sets and all this sort of stuff, but the concrete world he thinks is one. But through looking at that and the debate that Schaffer has with another two philosophers, Horgan and Paterk, he thought reality was just one big blobject with no parts. I realized that I came across Bradley, F.H. Bradley. When I read him as a monist, I thought, okay, this is the kind of monism I'm interested in. Because Bradley's monism was sort of what I think of as full-blooded. It was removing the distinction between subject and object. It involved theories on the notions of truth. He'd written 2-volume works on logic. So for him, his monism pervaded everything in the way he thought. And it wasn't this sort of slightly interesting metaphysical question that let's see if we can model it in our logic. So I knew I wanted to look at Bradley properly. I thought maybe it wasn't the best career move to do that for your PhD. So I came across Frege, a particular argument of Frege's about truth, and I thought that was more canonical. And my supervisor at Cambridge is a big fan of Frege, and he said, "Oh yes, do Frege. He's makes much more sense than the contemporary metaphysicians I was looking at." So I looked at Frege and his views on truth, which was I don't regret it at all. It was really good. I mean, Frege is, I don't know if you've looked at Frege much, but he's quite a mind, and spending 4 years jumping into him and trying to understand why he thought what he thought about truth, which we can discuss if you like, was really good practice. Because Bradley's great, but he's not quite so clear and specific as Frege is. So I think Frege is a good place to kind of cut my teeth, I think. Yeah.
So where are you currently standing in terms of how you see the world? If we just simplify it, you are a type of idealist, aren't you?
Yeah.
What can you take me through that kind of idealism and exactly what you believe? So I think, like, from hearing idealism, I understand that the nature of the world from your point of view is mind, but obviously you have unique perspective on idealism. So I'd love to hear it.
Well, I'll tell you what I currently think. It's definitely a work in progress.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that um, in the 19th century, there was just so much going on. The certainly in Britain, right? So there's the evangelical movement, which I think, because that's where I'm from, it drew my interest when I realized how much Britain was changing in the 19th century, moving away from a very strongly evangelical way of seeing the world in the Victorian Britain. And so even though philosophy was trying to understand the world from the human perspective, whether rationalist or empiricist, there still was this idea that reason was the gift of God and that it gave us access to truth because it's reason and it's the logos and so on. And really in the 19th century, with the theory of evolution, that all started to fall apart, really. And we had to sort of try and re-understand the world, thinking that our senses were just produced to survive, not for truth, to help us survive. Our reason as well was what we had been endowed to help us survive. It wasn't connected to any kind of divine gift for understanding. And so that was massive. And then psychology is coming out. So much there is going on about people trying to re-understand who we are. And it seems to me that things tended to go in one of two directions. They either went to the kind of Russell and Moore idea of moving away from idealism and sort of looking at language, seeing logic and mathematics as sort of this certainty, and understanding how thought is expressed in language, and that sort of set up the analytic tradition with the linguistic turn. So I actually think Frege's got idealist elements in there, but and so does Russell actually in some ways. But it didn't. It's sort of after that with the logical positivists and so on, a lot of that gets exercised out, and it became analytic philosophy is done today, which I think just sort of follows in the footsteps of science and doesn't really try to do what philosophy does really well, which I think is ask other questions as well and be open to more. Or you went kind of the pragmatist way and you started to root everything in terms of, total human. So the pragmatists are trying to base things in on what's useful, which to me is sort of trying to get a philosophy from the evolutionary kind of overall idea. And then you've got existentialism and some other things going on in the continent. But what I found about the British idealist movement is they were kind of neither of the above. So the idea was that, yes, we have to appreciate psychology. They're sort of a mixture between rationalists and empiricists. And so Bradley thought we experience the world sort of in two ways. We feel the world and so we encounter the world in feeling and we encounter the world in thought. And that to understand things like truth, we have to understand how truth is related to parts of our experience with each other. But whereas William James thought that the sort of involuntary aspects of our experience are just that, it's just the drift of experience that's pulling us along, and things like our concepts have arisen to be useful, structure the reality in useful ways. Bradley seemed to always maintain that that those aspects must be pointing beyond just experience to something else. So he's always trying to extrapolate beyond, and obviously that gets to the absolute. And so for me, I thought that sounds right. It seems as though we do recognize something beyond just what we immediately experience. But that thing beyond isn't something of a completely different sort. It's something that is a bit like our experience, but somehow fulfilled or consummated or pushed to its end point, that we experience in the norms of our aspects of experience. So I'm I need to have the time to really sit down with Brad. I don't know if what I'm saying is Bradleyan or not, but it's stuff that sort of was coming to me from having uh, read what I have read. There'll be a mix of me and him. But yeah, I think right now, I would say that I think truth uh, is prior to existence. In other words, things exist because we can say true things about them. So, and I think goodness and beauty are also the norms that drive feeling and will. And so, some kind of reality based on fundamental norms would be where I sit. I haven't delved into the aesthetics and the ethics side of it so much, but mainly on logic and the truth side.
So, what would be the difference between you and Bernardo in terms of the mind at large? Do you believe in the mind at large? You mentioned your Christian upbringing. Are you still a believer in God? And so, is this mind kind of extended around us? That is our mind and your mind and all the animals' mind. That is the mind at large, or do you take a different view?
I think I'm very different to Bernardo. I mean, the reason I looked into Bernardo was because as soon as I started mentioning idealism online, everyone said I had to look at Bernardo because he was doing stuff in the public. So I never heard of him. So no, he's not an inspiration for me, and I think his approach is very different to the kind of idealism that I'm drawn to. And he's taking his cue a lot from science, it seems to me. And I'm not sure how much you can make that work because I think whatever your philosophy of science is going to start to get in the way of your metaphysics.
Mm.
So the likes of Bradley want to say yes to science, but say that science is a discipline with its own questions it's trying to answer, its own methodology and its own assumptions. And when you're doing science, you abstract from the whole of human experience to focus on certain aspects of it because that is useful to what you're trying to do. But when you then step beyond that and say, because these are the entities I'm interested in, or these are the entities that I utilize to explain the things I'm interested in, but then say, therefore, these are the only entities that exist, he says is barbarous metaphysics. And I think any attempt to sort of point to entities that are utilized in the explanation of scientific theory and then make claims for idealism on the basis of its parsimony or whatever, utilizing the same kind of theory choice things that are used in science.
I think I'm with you. Sort of what I'm trying to get at is maybe it's wrong the way he gets to the conclusion, but do you have a similar conclusion that there is one mind at large? Because if you have a monistic view, right, and you're an idealist, then essentially there is only one mind, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I would prefer to phrase it in a more sort of Hegelian or Bradleyan way and say that there is ultimately one spirit.
One spirit.
Because our mind seems to suggest it's too much on the intellectual side. Mm. And this is where Bradley differed from Hegel and why he couldn't consider himself a Hegelian. Because Bradley thinks reality has to be constituted by more than thought. So this is where the sort of limits of reason kick in. Yes. That thought is very important. It is the way in which we are going to have to talk when we're doing metaphysics. And when we're doing metaphysics, we are seeking intellectual satisfaction. Mm-hmm. But it's not that everything must be understandable, everything must be capturable in thought. It isn't, because human experience also involves feeling, and it also involves will. And these things are not the same as thought. So I think, yes, to an absolute monism. Mm-hmm. Whether it's best to call that mind, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
But even if I were, it certainly wouldn't be the kind of mind that Castro puts forward, which to me sounds like, well, prior to my conversations with him anyway, when he talks normally, it sounds like a kind of less developed mind than humans in a prior evolutionary state. But when talking to him, he did sort of say at one point, well, time doesn't really apply, so you could come to other conclusions. And I'd want to say absolutely yes. I mean, I think space and time and so on, they are abstractions. They're part of appearance and not ultimately reality.
I'm really resonating so far. I didn't know about Bradley, but what you mentioned about mind being thoughts, feeling, and will really resonates with a lot of spiritual traditions, because I'm a avid reader and practitioner of spiritual traditions, and also I'm a philosopher. So I sort of do spiritual philosophy a lot of the times, and I really like that method. But what you mentioned really makes sense, because you know, in the Taoism you have the three dantians, the upper dantian, which governs the head and thoughts and thinking and cognition, and on the heart center or the middle center, which governs feelings, and then the will center, the third dantian, the lower dantian, where power and energy is sort of concentrated there. And you know, when martial artists punch at something, they sort of make this power, they drive their power mostly from the power center. So even in practical terms, you can see how there is yoga and there is Taoist internal alchemy techniques where they're developing these centers. And so it's a philosophy that is practical and experiential. So there's nothing analytical about it. But I suppose where the analytical comes from, for me at least, is after you understand that you feel and you can think and you can act in the world and you can tap into these different centers in your consciousness, that there's different sort of settings of consciousness. I don't know if that's a good word, but different ways of being in the world. It's not just about thinking, where the analytical philosophy kind of gets stuck upon. It's also about being embodied, being in the body, in the feeling. And I think partly it's because of the hyper-masculine sort of nature of our society, is that, you know, the feminine is eradicated from our worldview, because we don't see feeling as a way of understanding. We discard it as that's just feeling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting you talking again about another area of religious understanding where this trichotomy appears, because so many people, when I start talking, oh, that's just like this, it's just like that. It seems to be a recurrent theme in all religions, which is a good sign.
It's a perennial understanding.
Exactly. And I mean, I tend to talk about it in terms of the true, the good, and the beautiful. The true then would be, yes, the ultimate thought. It's the norm that drives thought and discourse, and it's the grit of disagreement, as Hugh Price would say as well. And the wonderful thing about truth is you can't actually express it. If you try to say something's true, as Frege pointed out, you're just saying the same. If I say grass is green, it's true, just the same as saying grass is green. So truth isn't something we can capture in language. It's something we do when we assert things.
Interesting.
It's the aim of judgment. It's the goal of thinking. The goal. So I think truth then is like the ultimate thought. Goodness is like the ultimate act, and beauty is like the ultimate feeling. Now, at some point, we recognize that these three must be one, because we don't experience a strictly separated form of human experience. We don't have feelings strictly separated from thought or strictly separated from will. We experience all three together. Yes. But we cannot kind of there's always ways in which trying to mix them together in our thinking just doesn't work, I don't think. So it's very helpful to think of them as sort of the primary division, the primary abstraction.
Yes.
So the primitive abstraction. And yeah, that comes out in all sorts of ways. Obviously, it's in Trinitarian thinking and so on. But I've kind of moved away from a religious language as a way of making sense of this stuff and trying to just focus on the metaphysics of it. But it comes up all over the place, which is a good sign.
What you actually said about a Trinity is exactly what came to me earlier, which was, I think, sort of the danger of what Bernardo is teaching and some other idealist philosophy is that it sort of says that mind is one, but then the different expressions of that oneness, which is mind, heart, and will, don't really get enough attention, specific attention. And I think that's why in the Christian tradition, I'm not sure if Christians meant it by that, but I think symbolically at least, uh, that God is one, and yet the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. It's like they are all mind, but they're different functions of mind. And it's important not to just say it's the same, right? There is uniqueness, and there is also ontological unity, but there's also uniqueness. And I think that's the same with us and other animals. Is that my teacher Rupert Spira? I don't know if you've heard of Rupert. He's had multiple conversations with Bernardo, but he speaks that there is the sun, so that's like consciousness, and each of us is like a unique ray of the sun. And I think I kind of like that idea that the essence is one, but also it is important to focus on the uniqueness, on the unique energetic template that you have. So that is to say, the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you act, right? So these are how the sun expresses itself in thoughts, feelings, and action. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the self is a big question. Understanding the nature of the self or the soul or the mind, they're often used interchangeably. I mean, I haven't really been able to delve into it to tell you exactly what I think about this yet. But the main difference, it seems to me, between us and the absolute or the one or whatever you're referring to it as is, the finitude versus the infinite, the bounded versus the unbounded. So I think we experience the one as this sort of end point of the aspects of human experience. Because I suppose if we think of ourselves as made in the divine image, then the only conception we'll have of the divine will be via understanding ourselves taken to some kind of endpoint. And this is where I think the truth, the good and the beautiful enter in. I mean, the beautiful is something transcendent in feeling. And the truth is something transcendent in thought. So the difference is then truth isn't 2 + 2 = 4 isn't entirely true. It couldn't be, because otherwise that would have already enabled us to reach the absolute place in our thinking. It's true to a degree. And the true itself is fully coherent and fully comprehensive. It includes all thinking in itself. And so it ends up transcending thought and becoming reality. That's Bradley's view. It's the thought's happy suicide. It's this sort of funny paradox of thought is aiming at it, but if it ever achieved complete truth, it would no longer be thought, because it would have to become united with feeling and will in that process. And it would be the same in the other cases. So I think it's always hard to talk about these ultimate things, but things like Trinity, I think, are pointing in the right direction. The idea of three in oneness, and how we fit into it. I think at the moment, all I'm happy to say is that we are some kind of finite expression of that absolute whole.
There's aspects of us that is finite. I saw that you made a video about NDEs. Now, I haven't had a near-death experience myself, but I spoke to somebody, I interviewed him, and he had a near-death experience when he was 10. And the literature on that, I think, is quite extensive. Now, I think the literature on NDEs and psychedelics are phenomenologically similar. So you mentioned that truth, beauty, and what was the last one? Goodness is transcendent, and I agree with you. But the other part of it, which is something that we humans can experience, I think one of some of the avenues that we can see that is the psychedelic experiences, where people take DMT or magic mushrooms, and they transcend the physical aspect of themselves to a transpersonal level of consciousness, where they do actually experience beauty. I'm not saying they experience beauty in an absolute way, but they do get out of the 3D world. So there is some new information to be learned. And I interviewed somebody called Andreas Gomez Emelson. I don't know, he's a DMT scientist. And he said, he's a strict scientist, and he said, essentially, he believes that you can experience 12 dimensions on DMT. And mathematically, so he's sort of showing that with geometry. with creating degrees of freedom in a three-dimensional space where you can create 12 dimensions. Now, whether those dimensions are real or not, they are experienced. So there's some phenomenology that we have to deal with here, which seems to be transcendent. But when you experience it, it's like you're almost experiencing the transcendent. And how is that possible, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and there's very little I can say on that. I mean, I haven't taken those substances myself, and I can't really say that I've had any transcendent spiritual experiences like that either.
Yeah.
I think my spirituality has just been, I think, a very deep rooted sense that life is meaningful,
Mm.
that things matter, people matter, what you do matters, what you say matters,
Mm.
and that everything's going to be okay. Um, and when I went to start studying philosophy, I knew that I had to be prepared to become an atheist. I had to do it properly. I got given, I think very early, I was given a paper by Daniel Dennett, and I knew who he was, but I'd never read him. And I was a bit terrified. Just I've been doing philosophy for like 2 weeks. But now this is the sort of paradox of it. I went into prayer and I said, look, God, if you're not real, I just want to know, and I'll move on. Because I'm doing philosophy now. I can't be reading this stuff with my guards up,
Yeah.
ready to sort of immediately reject everything I'm hearing or being fearful of it. So yeah, I think I was prepared to be an atheist at that point. And yeah, I prayed that if God wasn't real, he could help me become an atheist, which is obviously a paradox, or whatever you might call it.
Yeah.
But actually, ironically, I found that I couldn't sustain that doubt for very long. That
Mm.
even when I'd sort of walked away and decided to read it, there was just something in me that knew that that I could. It's strange. It was incredibly liberating. It was really like, if I have experienced spiritual things like this, I just felt completely
Mm.
held in grace. And so it did two things. On the one hand, it meant that I could completely read things and be as charitable as I could and genuinely try and understand the points of view of what I was reading, which if you don't do, you're going to be a hopeless philosopher. But then secondly, it also meant that I hadn't really got any fear anymore. And
Mm.
I mean, my views have changed massively. Of course they have. But I also just knew that I was a Christian and that it was more, I was being held more than I was holding on to God. And so it was incredibly liberating, because I think a lot of the people that I was around and in my upbringing, there was very much a kind of attitude of stay away from that stuff. You know, university turns everybody atheist. People, you know, Christians go, they lose their faith. A bit of anti-intellectualism, and so you grow up with this sense that we believe this stuff, but it doesn't really make sense. Don't try and make sense of it, because it will fall apart. I think that was partly because of the evangelical tradition I was a part of. It's not everywhere, of course. But I had definitely had that experience. We've experienced. I mean, it's not entirely my story to tell, so I won't make it public. But my wife and I have had some personal struggles that we experienced some miracles in. So we've definitely seen the hand of God move in ways that were quite profound. But I haven't had anything like a drug experience or gone to other realms or experienced 12 dimensions. I'll leave that to you.
I was actually gonna connect that. So I mean, it's okay you haven't experienced it, but you know, the experience of love itself is an experience of dissolution of the sense of self, whether that is love with your towards your mom or dad or towards your wife. That is a sense of dissolution and becoming one. So I think you don't need psychedelics. Well, the most psychedelic drug I think is love, and whether you love your cat or dog or animal or whatever it is you love, there is an evidence from reality that when you love something, you become one with it, and it's an experiential verification. So as a philosopher, you want to verify and test, and maybe this is the test reality is giving us to try. And when we try it, when we fall in love with whatever it is we love, maybe even with philosophy, we lose ourselves in it, right? We become one with it. And I think that's such an important thing. Even a sportsman loving and doing his activity, whether he's playing football or whatever, there is a feeling, an experience of unity with what he's doing. It's like a flow of experiences that occurs to him. It's not something that he's doing. It's sort of the object-subject distinction dissolves. But also, there's a feeling of non-locality, both in space and in time, when you are in the state of flow. You don't feel time if you're in a really engaging conversation. You also don't feel space much. And it's a very different experience of consciousness altogether when you go into this loving with whatever it is you're doing. And I think that's a clear communication from the universe telling us this is the nature of reality. From my point of view, you don't need psychedelics, but you do need something that expands your mind, like love, because psychedelics means mind expanding. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always found it easier to pray in places that are expansive. So yeah, as I'd mentioned, I lived in New Zealand for a long time, and that's a fantastic place to just wander off somewhere and pray. So I won't quite say mountains, but well, there are lots of mountains in New Zealand. It's not like really tall ones I went up, but places like that. Or growing up, I lived near the water, and there was an abandoned, actually old Victorian sewage outlet that wasn't used anymore. I used to go down there, and that would take you right out to the ocean. I think that there was that. Well, the English Channel. It's not really the ocean, but it seemed like it to me. So I went to the end of that, and I think somewhere where you are confronted by expanse or something far bigger than you, whether it's the heaven space and the heavens, whether it's the ocean, whether it's a mountain, there's something quite profound at feeling very small and feeling very insignificant. And I think that for me, there always is something that makes you want to just leap into that expanse and kind of lose yourself in it. And yeah, so you can experience that in nature, you can experience that with a loved one, you can experience that with something you're passionate about, like you're saying, a good book. And it's wonderful. It's actually quite nice to stop being self-aware for a while.
Yeah, and there's so many ways we can test this. That I interviewed the Taoist master last night, and we were speaking to him for more than 2.5 hours, and he went really, really deep, so deep that I was like, I don't know what to do with this. But one of the things he was talking about is when you go to the center of anything, because the Taoists are always trying to go to the center. And for him, it's a process of internal alchemy. So it's not just some idea he's speaking of. He means something energetically, which with his energy and attention, he goes to the center of, let's call them the different energy centers within the body. So you can find love or truth or beauty in nature, but you can also find that deep within yourself. And I think that is, in the religious language, it is the presence of God within, but it's too close to us that it's almost, you cannot distinguish it from the deepest aspect of ourself, the deepest truth of ourself. And I think that the more you dissolve into that, the more you realize there is no separation between you and whatever name you want to give that, whether big G or small g, the ultimate reality.
Yeah, so I think this touches on something that is maybe a distinction between meditation and prayer. So often they're sort of lumped together, but I do think, I mean, there's something about them that seems different to me. Whether or not they're sort of two ends of a circle that eventually meet, I don't know. But for me, in prayer, there's a losing of the self because you're throwing yourself into something bigger. It's a very outward focused thing. Meditation seems to be more of an inward focused thing, a way of descending within.
Yeah.
I tried for a bit of meditation. Yeah, it didn't do it for me in the same kind of way. So I'm not so sure. I think so philosophically where I'm at right now is that for me the absolute is something that isn't within me. I mean, it's images within me, and I consider myself to be a finite copy of it.
Mm,
I don't think I would be looking for it in the deep recesses of my soul.
mm. What are your thoughts about mystical states? Because mystical states,
Mm,
whether in Christianity, with Meister Eckhart, to Sufism in Islam, I don't know how much which tradition you're aware of, but in mystical states, it's the dissolving of the self in
yeah.
something transcendent. So you do become part of God or whatever name you want to give it. You do feel that, and you do experience a real experience that mystics talk about. And I don't think it's something that is unique to mystics. I think anybody with enough devotion and enough practice can experience this oneness with God. So God can become not something abstract, but it can become like your lived day-to-day experience that you always in the presence of God is, he's not like around you, he's within you, around you, and these words are just symbols. They don't really mean anything because there's no in, out, or outside or around. It's just there's just it. And um, I think after a certain training, like this Taoist master was speaking, like the presence becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, right? So
Mhm.
after a certain period of practice, whatever that practice is, one becomes so aware of the presence that is hard to deny it, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I no, I don't have that much knowledge or experience of mystical traditions really. My Christian upbringing was very Western,
Mhm.
and as I said, it was sort of evangelical, and so it wasn't that intellectually rigorous. So my understanding is mainly philosophical, and in analytic philosophy as well. So it's very left brain, analyzed, conceptual, and so on.
We're trying to connect it now with the other part, which I listened to and I really loved. So my thing is to connect the both sides together. But if something
Yeah.
makes the Eckhart said, you may resonate with this. He said, the eyes by which I see God are the same eyes by which God sees me," and it sort
Yeah.
of captures the mystical vision.
Well, yeah. I mean, I certainly think this anyway. I think that, I mean, using Trinitarian language anyway, there's the aspect of the Holy Spirit is the aspect of God within you, right?
Mm,
That will transform you from the inside. So I'm not saying there's no divinity within the self. Of course, there is, and we are, I think God's children as well. But I haven't. I don't want to start saying things I don't really know about so much.
I understand, yeah.
And so for me, I'm still trying to make sense in a kind of a in a theoretical way of, I suppose, something that's going to satisfy my intellect is a way of understanding what reality is like from a metaphysical point of view. And then as far as my spiritual practices go, um, I think, yeah, I mean, they don't tend to include meditation or anything. And so, but I'm
That's okay.
I'm interested in hearing what, you mentioned the death experiences stuff as well. It's actually, I mean, I didn't make a video on it. I met Max Baker Heitch at Oxford, and I was just chatting to him because he's a good philosopher. He's quite well known, and he told me he'd recently done a paper on it, looking at it. I mean, this is the joke. I mean, it's not a joke at all. But the interesting thing was is he was taking Bayesian reasoning to the data from NDE. So I mean, is a scientific approach to this stuff as you can write. So
Okay.
what level of evidence do these
Hmm, hmm,
testimonial reports give us if we take a Bayesian reasoning strategy to it in terms of the possibility of the afterlife or dualism?
hmm, hmm.
So that was the angle that he was coming from. But I mean, I
Interesting.
find, as I'm sure everybody does, I find these accounts very, very interesting. And I do believe in an afterlife, which actually is something Bradley doesn't believe in.
Mm.
Um, so it doesn't seem that weird to me that these sort of things would happen. But yeah.
So I had this idea and I thought I'd share it with you. At university, we study analytical philosophy, and I'm at St. Andrews now. So a lot of our
Yeah.
degree is just like reading and thinking. And you already agreed that it's important to incorporate feeling into the equation as well, and phenomenology. And actually, Rudolf Steiner schools, I think, are already doing that, which is a private international school based on the idea of Rudolf Steiner. But I thought when it comes to the philosophy of mind, particularly, it would be really useful to study analytical philosophy, but also study it in a combination of different phenomenological experiences that is sort of crossing over the different brain states, so alpha brainwave, gamma brainwave. And I think the importance of that is when you're stuck in analytical thinking, that's like beta brainwave, right? And so beta brainwave produces a certain kind of philosophy and certain kind of looking at the world, which is very linear, very left brain. But if you're in gamma, then the mode of consciousness completely changes. Same with theta, like a dreamy-like state, alpha, meditative-like state, or like praying would also fall into alpha. There's all these states of consciousness correlating with different brainwaves. And I thought if we study the philosophy of mind, it's important to also experience the different phenomenology of these states of mind that are correlating with these brainwaves. What are your thoughts of a curriculum of a university involving such an idea rather than just, beta brainwave analytical thinking and writing?
Well, I mean, I don't really know about the science of the brain as what you're talking about. I think really there's a place for any kind of discipline or method. And I'd be interested to know a little bit more about how much the beta brainwaves are associated with language. Because I think analytic philosophers should be far more humble about how much of reality is capturable in a theory or capturable in language. Physicists, ditto times 100. I think there's a certain arrogance and that if it doesn't fit within a theory, it doesn't exist. If it's not something that we can be clear and rigorous about, it should be discarded. So I'm very much against that. So I am an analytic philosopher. I am a metaphysician, and I'm a mathematician as well. So I am aware of the methods that I use to try and make sense of things. I think they are methods that to me seem more easily articulated. And it may be because, as far as I'm aware, the left brain is both the analytical, deconstructive, mathematical side, as well as the side that's linguistic.
Yeah.
So,
well, not fully. I don't think not fully, because if it's a expressing of language that is evocative or poetic, right, I think that would engage the right brain too. I think it would be both.
Yeah, so that's right. I've heard that, and this is the thing. So the British idealists were very sympathetic to poetry, and they thought it had a really important role to play. And actually, if you read Bradley and some of the other, they're not analytic philosophers in the way they write, which is partly why Bradley, I don't think, is looked at as much as he ought to be. I mean, he had a massive role to play in Russell and Moore and the formation of analytic philosophy. But you read his stuff, it's far more florid, it's far more kind of poetic in just his writing. So I think what you can do with a metaphysical theory clearly articulated and structured is limited, but I also think it has a place, and it can still be far more, I think, broad spanning than what you get from physics. So I think physics is true, but it's a certain kind of truth, and that truth is bigger than that. Yeah. And there is a way you can articulate something that is kind of the best you can do as far as grasping what reality might like in a structured way.
Let me make it a little bit more clear. I think with William James, for example, he talks about the different modes of consciousness. So this is sort of what I'm speaking of as, of course, you eventually should write your theory in a structured way, in a way that is logical and analytical. But the place the philosophy comes from, I think it should be from different modes of consciousness. So in a holistic way, if you have a philosophy of mind, it should include all of the modes, or at least a good sort of balance of the modes of consciousness that is not just the sort of analytical that is correlated with certain brainwave. So what I mean by that is it doesn't have to be an altered state, but it can be anything that doesn't cross over beta or this focused linear thinking. And then the philosophy of mind should speak about consciousness through these different modes, not just the mode of analytical thinking. Now, what are your thoughts on that? I don't know if I was clear. I'm trying to get it very clear, but if you have any questions on that, I can clarify.
Are you talking about well, so it seems to be you could mean two different things. So on the one hand, the bit I certainly would definitely agree with for sure, and then we can discuss the other thing you might be saying. I think any kind of account of the mind is going to have to include all aspects of the mind, yes. And that's something that, what I find restrictive about analytic philosophy, and it came out actually, I've just been doing the lectures on truth at Cambridge. I've got another one next week. They're nearly over, but for researching that, it was really interesting. For example, truth deflationism is the view that if you want to understand truth, you look at how the predicate is true functions in language. You see that is true in language can be, there's an equivalence between saying something is true and merely asserting it, which is something I alluded to earlier. And then there are very clever, complicated techniques to try and translate any sentence in English that uses the word true into another sentence in English that doesn't. This is Frank Ramsey started it, and it went from there. Frege has something similar, but he doesn't really push the point. So the idea is if I say something like, everything Bernardo says is true, I have to find a way to translate that without using the word, and I have to say for all P, if Bernardo says P, then P. So I have to do this sort of thing. But why are they doing that? They're doing that because they think if I can say everything I want to say in language without using the word true, truth doesn't exist. Or truth can be deflated, right? The idea is that's all, folks. There's nothing more to say about truth than how true works in language. We can use it to disquote sentences. We can use it to indirectly say things. But these are all just shorthands. They're techniques. And so if we can get rid of it from our language, that shows big philosophical claim, truth is not really an issue. Let's just move on. All it does is how it works in language. Now, I think the only reason you agree with that is if you thought that the only thing you need truth to do is to explain linguistic practice or to have some theoretical role to play within your logic. But then you realize that, hang on a minute, we need truth for all sorts of other things. Truth is tied up with our understanding of the connection between mind and world, with the norms of discourse and so on. And so it's only by a certain kind of blindness in method and what you think you're trying to explain. But then on top of that, take that extra step of if it doesn't fit within my interests, then doesn't exist at all. This is the stuff that Bradley would say is barbarous metaphysics, right? Which is also what physicists do all the time. Oh, we just talk about these sorts of particles. We just talk about this. Reality just is this. There's nothing else.
Yeah. So
anytime someone does that they constrain their subject matter and then think they've explained the whole of mind.
Yeah.
And this does come out when in some of the earlier philosophy of mind stuff, where it's assumed that mind is purely that which we have conscious access to. And now that's been shown that, obviously there's the subconscious and then there are other aspects of experience. Maybe this is what William James is talking about, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That is sort of precognitive. And this is what Bradley's talking about as well, the purely phenomenal, raw experience and so on before it gets structured in the cognitive way.
And that's exactly sort of going into the question, sort of the intention of the question I was asking, because with Carl Jung and the collective unconscious, but just with the idea, forgetting even the collective side of it, just with the subconscious aspect of us, which is the place where feelings are stored, feelings and memories, that is also a mode of consciousness in a way. And I think a holistic theory of mind should have all of these included within it, and not to prioritize one modality to the other. And so the dreaming state is like part of it. The waking state, obviously, That's part of the analytical philosophy, linear thinking, and then the psychedelic states, and then even like mystical states. I think I would categorize them in the same place, and so they would be like a holistic modes of consciousness, all within our theories of mind. And unless we know about some of the modalities, I don't think we're even philosophically eligible to judge that those states are not real. Because how can you judge something that's not real if you, as a scientist or as a philosopher, have an experience? So these physicists like Brian Cox who just say, "Oh, everything is physics and there's nothing more beyond it," it's just such an arrogant thing to say, simply because I don't think they have gone out of their way to explore different modes of consciousness that is this sort of physical 3D view of the world.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds right. I mean, the only philosophy of mind that I've done is sort of the relatively classic stuff about mind, body, and interaction, and this sort of stuff. I am interested in the modes of experience, things that I've touched on a little bit about, precognitive and then structured experience, so on. And Ned Block has some stuff on it too, but I certainly haven't delved into it massively, and I haven't read Jung or anything of that sort.
In your own experience, you have experienced synchronicities, right?
What do you mean by
that? Okay, so for Carl Jung, synchronicities were phenomena that seem to be accidental, but there's nothing causally you can show that those events were related. But on a deeper level, it does make sense and it does have a meaning. So causally disconnected, apparently, from all we know, but deeply meaningful and deeply emotionally evocative. I think sort of that's what he means. At least that's my interpretation. I've had tons of synchronicities. I think most people have had. Have you had any synchronicities?
I mean, probably. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't have used that term. I mean, there have been times when things seem to be very fortunate, sort of like things just coming together in a way that changes your life. The way I bumped into my now wife again was a kind of accidental event. I mean, I'd met her and then we hadn't been seeing each other around, bumped into each other at this sort of ideal time, and then things went from there.
Yeah.
Similarly, how I ended up studying philosophy, I didn't think I could. I thought I had to just study maths because I had to do it as a BSc. And so I was ready to enroll in physics as well. And then I had a call with someone. They said, "Oh, you can actually study maths as a BA, and then you could do philosophy as well." It was just before I submitted everything in. Now I've been studying philosophy for years. There's that. And again, getting the Gates Scholarship. I didn't know, but there was a really early application date. I happened to be talking to someone in London who had applied to it and said, "Oh, you better hurry up because the deadline's in about 2 days." And again, wouldn't have otherwise applied, and then ended up getting it another study. So, I mean, I don't know if this is what Jung's getting at or not, but there seems to be too much that's perfect and meaningful, like that,
Yeah,
I mean, you can of course call it coincidence if you want to, but
well, atheist materialists would dismiss synchronicities that happen in their own life, but if you are somebody who's open, and I think life communicates to you via synchronicities, so you meet the right person exactly at the right time, and these are like, for me at least, this is evidence for something that Jung touched upon, which is a collective unconscious, this interconnectivity of whatever it is that connects us all. And it seems like if you think in a certain way and you resonate with a certain way of being, suddenly the same person who resonates in similar ways to you, you suddenly find him. It's like kind of through the laws of resonance of some kind. Now, I'm not using resonance in a physical term. I'm using it in a more of a broader term. But something that you're doing is doing something to the collective, and then in turn there is an effect, like in quantum mechanics, there's a spooky action at a distance. I think I'm not the one who wants to say because of quantum mechanics this is true, but just to see correlations, as on a macrocosm and on a personal level.
So okay, for sure. So going back to that some of the stuff that I started with, I think that, yeah, it seems to me that at that time in the 19th century, and I say that because that's the period of time I'm interested in. It seems as though you can go one way and see reality is ultimately a machine, and everything is just either churned out or random. Now we've got to add that in. But then there's meaningless. On the other hand, you can think that everything is constructed by us. You know, that the concepts are purely human concepts. Then you get into conceptual engineering and you get into this idea that there are no actual categories, and it's all a power game, and it's all about oppression and so on, which is sort of the other way that you can go, which is effectively saying there is nothing outside of us humans and the way in which we interact. And I think both of those to me seem like kinds of atheism. They both seem to be kinds of denying personhood or spirit to that which is beyond us as humans. So I think that the kind of metaphysics I want to defend, and again, are non-religious and non-theistic grounds, but I think that once you have that, you recognize that reality is more something to which you relate than it is something you either manipulate or construct. And that you are in a kind of a two-way relationship with something bigger than you. And I've always had that sense. And I think that's where we get our sense of meaning. So yeah, nothing in the end is an accident. Nothing is meaningless or random, I don't think.
There's no true randomness.
No, but you're going to use randomness if for certain purposes. If you're doing physics, then you're going to use randomness. But that, as I said before, is because you're asking specific questions that are constrained questions about reality, utilizing a certain kind of method. You're using mathematics.
Yeah.
And
I thought that true randomness doesn't really exist because it just is from a limited perspective where you don't know the laws that are governing that thing, and you call it random just because you don't know the laws. So I don't think there's any true randomness, even on a quantum field.
well,
But
so I mean, I'm not a quantum physicist, but I know that there is often a distinction drawn between what we might call epistemic randomness, which is a way of modeling our own ignorance, and then what people think of as objective randomness, which is randomness built into the world. I haven't turned my mind to that really, or how that would work within an idealist framework, whether you can distinguish an epistemic from a metaphysical randomness if you're an idealist or not. But I think that is a distinction that's typically drawn.
yeah, I had sort of one more thought that I wanted to talk about. And obviously, you talked about your spiritual life and your religious life. But if you forget that and you just think of the analytical philosophy of idealism, the version of idealism you have, how would it affect you in a way that you see yourself, your relationships, and the world around you?
I think that it makes you really, what it does is it changes your value system, I think. Certainly from doing philosophy and thinking about these things more deeply, I have found I am less materialistic, less bothered about achieving specific kinds of success and so on. Maybe it's partly because I'm getting older. Maybe it's partly because I've done some things that are like success. Maybe, who knows? Maybe it's because I'm now a dad with a third child on the way, so your
Wow,
perspectives change.
that's amazing.
Yeah. No one has 3 kids these days anymore. What am I doing?
I don't have any, so
You don't have any. No, well, you got more time than me probably. Yeah, but I think for me now it's like truth and goodness and beauty are their end points. They're their own rewards. So I've definitely shifted from having a specific message I've wanted to prove to being happier with being a truth seeker, and recognize that because truth is ultimately ineffable and that everything is true to a degree, I think that certainly opened me up to talk to people who come at things from a different perspective and might use different language.
yeah.
from me. So my philosophy's definitely done that, which has been a good thing. I think it humbles you. Actually, good philosophy should humble you. I think if you do philosophy and you come away thinking you know more, then you haven't really done it properly. Yeah, and it has made me just more comfortable with myself, I think. But more, I think a lot of it has been more being able to articulate things I knew but didn't have the words for, and I think a lot of philosophy is self-discovery. And I'm at the point now where I do want to talk to other people about it, make sense of it more in my own mind to be able to articulate it more clearly, and then talk about it. Because I think culturally we're at a point now where this needs to be articulated and needs to be in the public sphere a bit more. So well done for doing this podcast and trying to do similar things.
Thank you so much for coming.
No, pleasure.
As you were speaking, something popped into my head, and I have to say it as a last sort of point of discussion. You were saying that truth, goodness, and I keep forgetting beauty. Sorry, beauty are transcendent and beyond language in a sense, and I agree with that. You know, if you try to tell somebody about compassion, that's not compassion, right? But you can be in a way in the world where you transmit compassion, or the way you are is compassionate, and you don't need to speak and teach somebody about compassion. It's just the way you are is itself the theory that is like the best theory, but it cannot be spoken, because once you speak it, it's not that thing, right? Or maybe it is, but the substance of it was your state of being and not the words that you used to express it. Same with beauty or goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sounds good.
All right, man. Thank you so much for we are on the same line of thinking. Yeah. All right.
Right.
Thank you so much for being and give me your time. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. Hopefully, come to St. Andrews. Maybe give a lecture. Be my guest.
Okay. All right. Maybe I will.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great night, brother.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.